Good afternoon. The focus of today's presentation is domestic and foreign disaster response and recovery. And we've got two wonderful folks here to guide us through this very important topic. But before we start, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the Center for Active Living for allowing us to use this great space, and also Sandwich Community Access TV, who have done a wonderful job in educating the public on important issues like this. This is part of a series called Government Unlocked, and I commend you all to watch it. It's an educational series that looks at our government, the foundations of our government, including an in-depth look at our Constitution and the history of America, and also talks with federal employees and what their role is in supporting our country and the work of our country. But today, we've got Paul and Bill. Bill Schmid served with FEMA since 2017. Most recently, he served as the Federal Disaster Recovery Officer until his retirement in August. Bill has been deployed to over 30 disasters from Alaska to Puerto Rico, including wildfires, hurricanes, and flooding, and he has supported disaster operations throughout the country in many capacities, including team leader for FEMA for Region 1 and as an Emergency Services Branch Director. And we also have Paul Bolton. Paul is Senior Scientist with Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Center for Public Health. Paul has over 30 years of experience in disaster planning in over 30 low and middle income countries, working with NGOs as well as government agencies. From 20 to 2023, he served as USAID's first mental health coordinator. Gentlemen,
thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, my sincere thanks. I will thank also the facilities and the people that helped us get here today, but thank you for braving not only the fog, but the torrential rain. We came down in a pretty thick fog, and then as soon as we got here, we got this. But thanks a lot for making it out. This is a series that Paul and I put together when we found ourselves both out of the respective jobs that we enjoyed, worked for, had such a passion for, simultaneously, Paul for USAID and me for FEMA. And we thought that what we would do is kind of combine our forces to try to help people understand what the impact is to the current and ongoing changes in the federal government and how that not only applies to locally, but to internationally. A lot of people wonder how things in Texas would apply to people in Sandwich, or how people in Mashpee can relate to issues that are being now battled in Africa and foreign countries. So what we thought we'd do is we try to share our perspectives with people, try to generate some conversation, discussion on it, and see if we couldn't get to help people understand, but also if they're interested in doing something, wanted to get involved, wanted to try to make a change, provides those options. The one thing that I want to get out of the way at this point is that this is an apolitical discussion. To the degree that it can be, Paul and I don't represent nor endorse any particular party. The message itself is important enough to stand on its own. And we think that there's enough common ground for all of us to empathize with the message and be concerned about not only what's going on in everyone's different spheres, but what will undoubtedly have repercussions in our own lives. So when we talked about disasters, we're talking about relief to disasters, but what I'm challenging us all on is to expand our definition of disasters. Disasters are not what we currently think of with a hurricane or a flood or a fire, etc. Anything that has a long or catastrophic impact on the civilizations, the communities that it's happening in is a disaster. So when we talk about wars, when we talk about starvation, that is a disaster by its definition. So how do the relief efforts of what we know as traditional disasters and these other disasters, how are they being affected now, and what things have happened already that are already in place that will change the face of disaster relief, that has already changed the face of disaster relief, hopefully not permanently. So, I'm going to take it, local consequences, spread it out to regional results, national impacts, and then the international fallout. And then where does this leave us? Where does tomorrow, the next day, the next day, the next year, where do we see ourselves being in these scenarios, and what are the concerns that we need to start to consider now, or a while ago, but now? The US government, as we all know, pays to help us out in disasters. It's what FEMA was built and designed for. That is changing. It already has changed. Thankfully, we have not had too many epic disasters here in the United States recently. You know, we had this one devastating flood in Texas a couple months ago, and we saw what the lack of coordination caused there. Had we had a larger events, there would be real concern. And we're going to talk a little bit about how these larger natural events are speeding up to proportions that professional meteorologists, professional scientists are very, very concerned. The last two hurricanes were epic. Their proportions and the way how quickly they built up were mind-boggling. And had that hit the United States, it would have been terrible. Terrible enough where it did impact. You know, Jamaica's got to, I don't know how long it's going to take them to recover if they can. Because a lot of infrastructure in those countries, which Paul will talk about, is already compromised. So we talked about the growing frequency of disasters and also the growing intensity of those disasters. And the role of the federal government up to this point has been very involved. Very, very involved. And now we're seeing with this administration a change in philosophy about that. Their change of philosophy is that the federal government, for the most part, is not going to be the people that bail you out. The states have to bail themselves out. Now, what a reasonable question is to ask is, are the states prepared for that? Do they understand what that means? And my argument would be no, because we don't even know what it means. FEMA hasn't decided what that means. So who will get what disaster funds and what relief, when, under what circumstances, all that's up in the air. So let's take a look at some quick proposed reductions that where the 2026 budget has been suggested. You see HUD, 44%, almost half. The State Department, which has a large influence about what Paul's going to talk about today, 83%. What does that do to our international status? 83% reduction. Health and Human Services, HHS, probably one of the closest things to home that we have in terms of agencies that are going to have direct and improportional impact to our communities. EPA, you know some people at EPA, they're down by half. NSF, Endowment for the Arts, NASA. So all of these things are proposed cuts for the 2026 budget. If we just kind of narrow in on the effects from FEMA, cut by, $6.5 million. The workforce is down to a third between voluntary and involuntary retirements. Staffing shortages are acute. And when you think about it, if you were a young person looking for a job, would the federal government at this stage be an enticing prospect? I don't know. So let's talk about some of the potential or very, very realistic impacts of these layoffs and these cuts. The loss of institutional knowledge, we were just talking about that. So when I was in New Mexico for the wildfires over the summer, and this is when all of the changes and turmoil had just started to really peak with the federal government and FEMA. And my predecessor, my go-to guy in Washington, D.C., quit. He said, enough is enough. I can't do what I need to do to make the American public safe. I won't do it anymore. And at that same day, the guy, my second favorite guy in FEMA, the guy who ran the region that I was in, he also left. So there's my two bright and shining stars that I was kind of aspiring to, left the same day. So when I got back from the wildfires in Mexico, I had to think to myself, can I still do this job, which I love, or loved, and still represent the people fairly and equitably and with the degree of purpose and dignity that it deserves? And that was certainly been compromised through the months. So the loss of institutional knowledge, not only at the FEMA level, but at the federal level, we see it happening in large swaths. I was talking to a young man who works for FEMA now, and the influence of AI, which we'll talk about very quickly later on. The influence of AI is going to be pervasive in everything we do. And right now, what he's doing, he's writing code for Department of Homeland Security to look for those key words, climate change, DEI, equity, et cetera, to root out those words in grant proposals. So targeted reductions in areas that mean a lot to the people that care. Climate resilience, climate change, call it whatever you will. It's real and it's not getting any better. And when do we reach a point of no return? When do we make so many mistakes, maybe with the climate, maybe with HHS, but at what point are these mistakes irreparable? We're going to talk about that. Paul's going to talk about it anyway. Erratic disaster declarations and less federal funding. What has the Institute just did a study yesterday, day before. They talked about which states are getting federal disaster funds, which states are getting disasters declared. Go ahead, take a guess. Red versus blue. So a disproportionate of red states, what we call red states, are getting disaster relief funds allocated to them or getting a disaster declared in that area. So if we note the political influence on disaster declaration and disaster funding, that leads to an erratic idea of what we can count on. What is reasonable to say, okay, it was a 12-foot snowstorm, we'll get a disaster declaration. Well, will we? Even today with the government shutdown, it's another kind of shining example of how erratic our government is and how it performs not to really what the people need, but what the political climate is. That's redundant. A diminished federal capacity to support communities. Okay, Sandwich. Okay, Massachusetts, you're on your own. Best of luck. We'll send you a check if you need it. But meanwhile, urban search and rescue, sheltering, DEA's assistance with oil spills. All of that, we'll see. The future of FEMA remains uncertain. So the current administration, there's the sunshine. The current administration has done 3 kind of surveys on FEMA. They assigned people to go and say, what are the issues with FEMA? 2 of those studies have come back and found that FEMA in general is okay. It didn't come back with that glaring issues that have been inferred in the past several months. So there is a third major one that is going to come out in the next couple of weeks that will pretty much decide FEMA's fate. What is it going to look like? I think it's fair to say there will be radical changes. The administration wants some very, very radical changes. This board that came out with the study, I think it's going to try to propose more moderate changes, but I think that there's going to be a lot of upheaval in the FEMA world, to say the least. So, traditional roles, FEMA, that we all know and realize, radiological support, earthquakes, volcanoes, long-term power outages, drought, tsunamis, hurricanes, large SEER events. SEER events, Super Bowl, the Boston Marathon, presidential elections and inaugural things. FEMA's in those. They might be in the background, but one of FEMA's big jobs is coordinating other government agencies. The role of FEMA is unique to any other federal agency. FEMA is the only agency that assigns other federal agencies to do things. So we're great at coordinating other federal agencies because we work with them all the time. So these large SEER events is something that is very commonplace for FEMA to be involved in, but maybe not a lot of people know about it. Now there's this other dimension of things that are happening, that because FEMA has gotten a relationship with the states and other federal agencies and both administrations, through the years we've been brought into immigration, into terrorism, into cyber warfare. Drone use is going to be a big thing coming up. International involvement, AI we talked about, space weather. We do a space weather forecast all the time. Radio waves are adversely affected by space weather. Something I didn't know. And we talked about political influence. How is political influence going to decide who gets what disaster support, and how are we, the communities, the states, going to respond? So let's kind of sum up this very brief, only kind of a snapshot, a dart being thrown to the board of some of the things that we see coming downstream. Funding allocations, there's already adjustment in funding allocations. Normally, let's say a normal disaster would be a 75-25 split, federal government to state. That's arbitrary. That can be erased or increased percentage-wise by the president. So what is that going to look like? And the criteria for disaster declarations has always been kind of set. Hit this threshold, you will likely get a disaster declaration. Now, what is that going to look like? Mitigation efforts. So, Sandwich is a unique community. You've got the ocean on one side, you've got the bay on the other. There are real concerns with water here, in terms of flooding. To say nothing of, you've got Otis Air Force Base in your backyard. We all know that a mass evacuation on the Cape, how should we put that? Challenging? Paul is relatively new to the area. I was explaining to him, within the first half hour, those two bridges will be done. So I guess we're going to have to take the tunnel. So mitigation efforts. I live in Scituate, so we live right on the water also. So seawalls or drainage to Main Street. All those mitigation efforts are now going to be they're going to be scaled way back if they even exist. So not only reacting to disasters that are happening or will happen, but how do we prevent them in the future? What do we do to compensate for them? That's all going to change. Community engagement, shifts in policy on how local communities will react with the state. There's going to have to be a much more verbose conversation with the state and what the communities have to do by themselves, think shelter. And this will keep shelter in mind as a discussion, because when we think of shelter, we think about the American Red Cross. How's that affected by disaster aid and funding internationally? Very interesting point. So, housing, medical care. Medical care, as we all know, is in crisis by itself. It's on the razor's edge. Now what's happening with medical care is being pushed to a precipice. Property values, environmental consequences, if we don't have mitigation efforts, if they're changing the floodplains, if they are changing the ordinances of building codes in flood areas, what will that mean to property values? Chilling effect on international relations. I worked the World Cup last time it was here. I volunteered for the World Cup this time. Current administration has threatened to take the World Cup away from, and now with the challenges of people traveling back and forth in and out of the country, it's affecting the World Cup plans, which is really unfortunate. So there is kind of a picture of the concerns that I see happening now, threatening to blossom. Paul's going to go through his thing on the impacts on how foreign disaster impacts us all here. And then we're going to get together at the end of the presentation and talk about kind of a summary of what we're seeing and then make some suggestions on what we all can do. And then hopefully you have enough energy left in you to ask some questions or spark some dialogue, because that's a favorite part of this. So I'll turn it over to Paul now, okay?
Thanks, Bill.
Okay, my friend.
Hello, everyone. So as I was introduced, so I've worked in foreign assistance since actually the early 1990s, and I was 3 years at USAID. Most of the rest of the time I was actually a grantee of USAID programs working with NGOs. And so I want to take a few minutes to talk a bit about that. I'll give you some statistics and figures, but very much I want to talk about, my own personal experience. Like, I worked in about 35 countries. What did I see? Just to frame this in the same way that Bill had it with domestic, from a disaster point of view, in foreign assistance, it's the same kind of thing with disaster response. You're bringing in resources where local existing resources are not enough to cope with a disaster. The thing about USAID programming and foreign assistance in general is that we very much really did focus on the poor. We weren't going out and doing disaster assistance for wealthy people in wealthy areas. There's always more need than there is money. So US foreign assistance was very good at knowing who were the people most in need and focusing our efforts on them. The other thing is that when it came to disaster relief, we did the stuff like FEMA in other countries, but we also looked at things from a chronic point of view. So we saw poverty, war, diseases, rights violations as being chronic disasters, and therefore very much part of our agenda as well. In terms of rights violations, there we're talking about, when people like many countries, women, children, ethnic minorities were excluded from national discourse and even excluded in terms of resources, then those would be the populations in which we would focus our efforts. And we were very much involved in mitigating disasters. So it wasn't just a disaster happens, we go in and help, then it happens again and again and again. Programs very often also had things about how we're going to prevent flooding in the future, how we're going to prevent famine in the future, how we're going to prevent riots and disorder in the future. So USAID and foreign assistance in general was very much involved in reducing the incidence of disasters. One of the criticisms that I've heard a lot about foreign assistance, more so this year, is that, foreign assistance is you're just giving money to people in other countries and you're kind of making them lazy and you're not making the situation any better. And do people really appreciate the aid that the US provided? So this was a scene I saw in Uganda I had been during the day visiting a school that we were working on where we were providing resources and salaries for teachers. And so it was great. You saw the kids in the classroom, they had a school, they had a teacher, they were paying attention. But then I walked through the town in the evening and there was one street light. And all of these kids are gathered under that one street light doing their homework from the school during the day, because that was the only lighting they had. So they were going to make sure that they took advantage of the opportunities that the school provided. We saw that over and over again, where people were very appreciative and made the maximum use of whatever assistance we could give them. Focusing on war is a big issue because war mainly affects civilians. So as you see there, it used to be that war was about competing armies. Go back to Napoleonic days, for example, it was mainly combatants who were killed. That is just not the case anymore. It is way above 90% of the casualties of war are civilians, because they're the people who get targeted now. Increasingly, armies, forces of occupation are not attacking the other side. They're attacking what they perceive to be their civilian support. This was a mass grave that I visited in Rwanda, where groups from the insurgency army came in and basically just killed as many people as they can in a population who they perceived to be the enemy, even though they were non-combatants. So again, we focused with our foreign assistance on the most vulnerable. So this was a World Vision program and it targeted children. Right? So it was mainly focused on helping those children who were affected by the war, or any other minorities or groups that most needed help. We also were involved in programs against disease, but again, not only disease, but the most affected people. There used to be a rumor going around in much of Africa that if you had HIV, one way to cure yourself was to have sex with a virgin. And that way, the idea was you would pass the disease to them and it would leave your body. So you can imagine the impact of that kind of belief on vulnerable, particularly vulnerable young girls. So we got involved in programs to try and counter that point of view and protect people. And I've always been very proud of that in our programming. I've always been very proud that wherever we worked, we tried to figure out who was the most in need. Who were the people who were not being helped by anyone else? And they would be the people we would target. And I still feel that immense sense of pride that was something that we used to do. Excuse me. So how was the assistance done? So it wasn't just done by USAID, that was just the agency I worked for. But all these other agencies were involved in foreign assistance as well. Even with all of these agencies, this was only 0.8% of the 0.87% of the federal budget. There was a survey that went out a few years ago, I think it was like 10 years ago, and I asked Americans, how much of the federal government do you think is spent on foreign assistance? And the average figure was people thought it was 25%. So when we saw these figures working in foreign assistance, we said, we're missing a great opportunity. What if we went out and we said to everyone, okay, would you support limiting foreign assistance to 1% of the American budget? We would probably get most people saying yes, right? And so that would be actually voting for a 20% increase in assistance, because people didn't realize that it's such a small amount of the actual federal government. The other thing is USAID, State Department, all right, Peace Corps, all these others, they don't do anything. They give money to NGOs, to charitable organizations, and these are the ones who are actually providing the assistance. So I've always felt like when I heard at the beginning of the year that USAID and other groups were described as being evil and corrupt and having terrible programs, and that were against American policies and not really helping people. The thing is, that was really criticizing these agencies, because these were the agencies that were implementing it. So they must have been complicit in this kind of thing. So my experience is, and perhaps to the extent that you've worked with these agencies, they are not like that, right? Many of them are Christian organizations who express Christian principles in the best possible way of, again, trying to help the poorest of the poor. We also supported international organizations like WHO and the Pan American Health Organization as a globally collaborative effort. So we would come together. These organizations are ways for governments to pool resources, to do collective programs to expand human health, to eradicate disease, to reduce chronic disease. So it's like a force multiplier, our dollars added to other countries' dollars to really do good for humanity. And then finally, we spent money doing research to try and make the programs better. And this was a lot of what I did. I spent a lot of my career as a researcher. And it wasn't like ivory tower stuff. It was more about, okay, we have a malaria program. How can we make it more cost effective? How can we make it more effective? How can we reach more people? And so over the years, the programming got better and better and better. And we accumulated a whole lot of knowledge, which frankly is now lost. We used to put this knowledge into huge government databases that anyone in the world could tap. But this year, at the beginning of the year, those databases were erased. So we actually lost this knowledge. I'm actually involved in a conversation with former USAID people to try to find out which of our information did anyone keep on any kind of server, trying to put it back together. So here's some figures. Right, was it worthwhile? Well, we estimate saved, but just in those 20 years, more than 90 million lives. For another group, another 95 million people, we made their health better, right? Particularly mothers and babies. Somebody said, I think it was in The Economist, they wrote that with the collective human efforts, of which the US government was a big part, one of the best things that's happened in the last few decades is we've actually expanded human lifespan by twice as much. People are now living twice as long as they used to live, right, even 50 years ago. And a lot of this has been due to improvements in life expectancy in low and middle income countries that foreign assistance supported. Educated 23 million people directly, again with a focus on particularly women, trying to make up for those countries where female education is not a priority. And then we've cut death rates by half. Sometimes you get the criticism that aid doesn't do much, right? That you just keep putting money into these, I don't want to say hellholes because that's the administration's language, but difficult places that are really suffering, and it never leads to any improvement. But that's a misperception, right? Global poverty has decreased by 2 billion. But the thing I always think about is this, 2049. That's a date. That was prior to this year. It was estimated that for the first time in human history, in 2049, there would be less poor people in the world than non-poor. That we were actually on our way to reaching that objective. And so we were making real progress. Then we don't have smallpox anymore, largely due to collective efforts, including those due to US assistance. Polio was almost gone by the end of last year. Now this year it's making a comeback. Polio has now spread to new areas that it wasn't in before. So how does foreign assistance help us? Us being the USA. When it's done right, people really do admire and like the United States. You may hear stories about how people in the other countries resent or criticize the US. And I've heard that too. But I can tell you that that's the elites. Those are the wealthy, powerful people in other countries who who don't like the United States coming in and doing the things that they should be doing, don't like the United States interfering with their persecution of minorities, with their ignoring the needs of their women and their children and other groups. They're the ones who resent US. But people on the ground, I've never seen it. I've only ever seen gratitude for the things that the US government had done. We make allies, right? Where we go into countries where we do have real national partners, both in business and in government. People do, in many countries, do appreciate what we do. And so that actually gives us what's been termed soft power, where we're well regarded. People are willing to meet and work with us on issues that affect all of us, right? So when there's an outbreak of Ebola, CDC used to send people out to West Africa to deal with Ebola. The governments would welcome that, right? Would welcome the US coming in and giving assistance so that we would control the problem overseas. The same with polio that I mentioned. We used to give resources overseas so that polio would stay overseas and be reduced, not make a comeback to the US. When we have friendly, stable and prosperous countries as partners, it really benefits us, right? So not only do we gain access, but we invest in our own interests. So 10 of the 15 major trading partners used to be recipients of foreign assistance. Now we make money from each other. And then foreign assistance reduces the need for military interventions. Overwhelmingly, US military, when asked about the effects of foreign assistance, consider it to be important. There was a general who used to be in charge of operations who testified to Congress that if Congress reduced the budget of the State Department and foreign assistance, then they'd better buy more ammunition, because they're going to need more ammunition because of the loss of the stability efforts, the stability maintenance efforts that foreign assistance and the State Department brings. So it's actually a cost benefit to us to stabilize and assist other countries. And then finally, I said 0.8% of the federal budget was spent on foreign assistance. A lot of that money went back to the US. So to buy food from farmers. The agricultural sector was a big recipient of foreign assistance dollars. We would buy the food and send it overseas. The same with business and products. So a lot of the money actually benefited us here at home. You want to take this forward?
Yeah, so we reach a point, yeah, this is kind of both of us. We reach a point now that we've been throwing a lot of facts and figures and some pretty devastating pictures at you. And we come to the point and say, okay, how does this impact us? What does it mean to us, and what are we going to do about it? We talked about standards eroding to a point where they may not be able to recover. Paul, that 2049 number, date, since we first started rehearsing and seeing this, that thing jumped off the page at me. I said, Paul, explain this to me. That number has gone away. So we talk about things that may have now slipped out of our control. With what has happened already, certainly the year 2049 is off the table. Can we get 2050 back on the table? Who knows? But the erosion, the stuff that we care about, pick an issue. Is it the climate? Is it the trees? Is it the trout in the brook? Is it the whales off your coast? All of these things are affected and are being degraded. In Paul's point, people are dying. In Texas, in that flood, people were dying. Children were dying. The environment actively being degraded. And Paul talked about it, and I've inferred it. The watchdog element of the federal government, where do grants go? How are they administered? How are they introduced and followed up on, and what has their success been? Gone. So not only are we taking an outstanding majority of the assistance that we've been rendering to people, but the monitoring and the application of that assistance now is in question. The threats of the geopolitical atmosphere. When I think of shelter, I think of my good friends at the Red Cross. They got money from USAID. So now what does that look like? Do you remember, what was it, a tornado a couple of years ago here, right? Tornado, right? And it was really kind of unusual. And a lot of us were kind of taken aback at the thought that, what is Sandwich, double the population in the summer, roughly? A lot of the people here are summer people. Do they know where their shelters are? Are there sellers in the rentals that they're renting? Do they know where an evacuation route is? Likely not. So that dimension of a disaster on Cape Cod in the summer, we still have, what we would think what we would rely on for Red Cross, but a lot of their base is eroding too, the volunteer base and the money that they get. So what is that going to look like? Nobody knows, and that's the real big question. The further conditions regress, the further that this goes on, quite obviously, the worse it's going to be. However, there are things we can do. There is a certain sense of community. There's a certain sense of how can I help my neighbor when disaster hits. I saw it every time I deployed someplace. We'd walk down the road in Texas and the guy's roof would be blown off. His cattle are scattered. I learned so much more about wildlife, but it's a story for another day. Cows don't swim very well, just to let you know. Don't worry about me. I just lost the roof. Head down the street. That guy's really hurt. Up in Vermont, we'd go to a farm, and these people all had their tractors out, heading down the street to pull their neighbors' bridges back onto the canal or whatever it was. There's a certain sense of unity we get when our back's up against the wall. My contention is our backs are against the wall, so we have to call on this sense of unity. We can get back from here. We've done it before. We can do it again. But we can't let the standards erode. This is it. Shut up, Bill, and get to the point. We have to let our representatives know that these things mean something to us. Paul, may I call on you? When you say to Senator X, sir, why aren't you acting or reacting to the USA aid, essentially eradication? Why aren't you doing something about it? What did they say to you?
Yeah, it's a good point. What they say is we're not hearing anything from our constituents about this, so it's a non-issue. So I've had the chance to talk to Republican and Democrat members, mainly their staff. So they're in charge of tracking, what are the constituents saying? And they say, no, it's a non-issue now. So for Republicans, it's never really been, in this administration, it hasn't been an issue. But Democrat representatives, they think that the population's moved on and that this isn't a concern anymore.
And the only way that we're going to get to move the needle is if we tell the people who are in charge of moving the needle that it matters to us. And that's why we're here. We're trying to bring the point back to the people that we live with in our communities, saying this matters to us for these reasons and most likely your own personal reasons. And make sure your elected representatives know it. And then support the agencies that are doing something. I'm volunteering I don't know if anybody's heard about this group in Scituate Sands. It's Scituate, active in national and local disasters. And they support not only the local community, but other people who are not able to recover from whatever happens, fire, flood, whatever it is. These people are doing the right thing. They're sending the right message. They're affiliated with the right people up and down the political spectrum. I support them. Boots on the ground. Let's get out there and do something. Please help us share the message. Please help us help another generation get involved. How do we, and it's a challenge that every single time we go out to speak to people, how do we engage the younger generation? Get them off their phones and get them to take a stake. It's their future. I'll be long gone by most of the time that some of this stuff comes to fruition. This is all happening now. Help us. Your interest and commitment is the driving force for change. Your interest and the kind people that were kind enough to have us here and set this up are the reason that we're here. It's the primary engine for change and advancement for what we all can agree is right. Regardless of what side of the political spectrum you live on, there are fundamental truths that we can all get behind and help change. Thanks to Scituate Community TV. Thanks to the Center for Active Living. Thank you for allowing us into this stunning facility. The technology here is impressive. I won't degrade where else we've been. These are our respective emails. We would like very much to be able to continue this discussion, answer any questions, whatever you would like. Is there anything that, Paul, you would like to wrap up with?
Write to your member of Congress.
Okay. He's going to be really, I have to drive an hour home with him. He's going to be really upset if nobody asks any questions. So please, dear God, do me a favor. Anything from you two before we wrap up this portion? No? Okay, great. So let's play question and answers, or dialogue anyway. Tell us what you're thinking and what questions. Jen, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Are we doing any foreign aid at this juncture at all? And also, since we've lessened the amount of foreign aid we're providing to the rest of the world, are there other countries who are taking advantage of this and filling in the void?
Not counting Argentina.
I don't know what that return on investment is.
We're doing foreign aid, but it's very limited and it's transactional. So it's basically giving foreign aid. For example, you saw the deal with Ukraine, right? We made them sign over a large part of their resources in order for us to give them aid. The aid to Argentina is also transactional in that sense. But in many ways, we don't know what the underside of that deal is. The State Department, which absorbed USAID completely, has put out a statement in October saying that from now on, the US government will help other countries with HIV, TB, malaria, and polio. But apart from that, we won't do anything. So those are the only things that we're concerned about, we're saying, in foreign aid at the moment. And that's the plan going forward. I have to say that based on what's happened this year, though, I'm skeptical that even that is going to happen. You saw earlier in the year at the beginning that there was, anger about stopping life-saving programs. So Secretary Rubio said, okay, we'll issue waivers, to allow some programs to continue. So none of that has happened. It's the same issue as you asked me about, is that when the government thinks that people have moved on and are not paying attention anymore, they just quietly don't do anything. Because we're not pushing back. We're not saying, okay, what happened to this? What happened to that program?
And to your question about other countries' aids, Paul, can you give a little example of proportional percentages of aid? Like what do other countries give as a percent?
Well, going forward, right, here we are now. So one of the unfortunate knock-on effects is that we really have a lot of influence on other countries, developed countries, and what they do. So countries like in Western Europe and UK, Germany, Denmark, other similar countries, they've all responded to the US cutting back of foreign aid by cutting their own aid back. So their UK, I think, is I think it's a 30% reduction to begin with, and maybe more now. And the other countries are doing the same. Meanwhile, I think the other theme of this is that China is stepping in. And China doesn't have a good reputation for doing things because it's the right thing to do. You know that they're stepping in with aid because they see the cost benefit of it. The same cost benefit that we used to see, they see. So they're going forward and they're becoming the dominant power in the world now in terms of influence and in terms of creating relationships with other countries. There was another thing you asked also, Anne? Okay. To Bill's point, even when we were providing foreign assistance, there was often a criticism of, well, like, why is it always the US? Why does the US give all this money, right? And it kind of looked that way. So I would go out to a program in another country like Zambia, and I'd see the Danes would set up this little program, and then the Australians would set up this little program, and there would be this huge US program, right? And so people would say, wow, the US is so much more generous than other countries because they have these, much bigger program. But people overseas and in our own country, we don't realize how huge our economy is. So even though we have a much bigger program than everyone else, we were giving the smallest percentage of GDP per person, that smaller percentage than any other developed country, right? Every other developed country that you can think of, even last year, was giving a bigger percentage per person. It was costing us on average, US citizens on average, about $2 a week for all the foreign assistance that we were giving around the world, which was less than anyone else. And now, of course, it's a lot less.
Sir.
Yes, notwithstanding any limitations on references to partisanship, but to carry that point that you just made about the international aid being transactional, we've heard here in this country relative to FEMA assistance that certain areas that voted one way or the other might be less likely to receive federal assistance in the case of emergencies as a result of, pettiness.
Up to this point now, I'm not saying that it is an administration decision, but that has been definitively proven to be the fact. That the outstanding of majority of the states that have received grants or got declared for federal disasters have been what we consider red states. The only exception was a tribe in Michigan, and the administration mistakenly said that Michigan was the area that was approved for disaster relief funding, but that was inaccurate. It was the tribe that was in Michigan at the time. So that has proven to be the fact up to this point under this administration.
I haven't even seen anybody throwing paper towels recently. In the showmanship.
No, don't you? I'm not going there. Left-handed throw.
I was just wondering if you could tell us, how do you account for the shift in lack of understanding of the cost-benefit ratio? What's precipitated that?
I don't know if it's been that much of a shift other than a reliance on that, a default reliance on the federal government to step in when needed. And what we are trying to do is saying that's no longer what we've counted on up to this point has changed. Not will change, has changed. To what degree it has changed and how that will be implemented in future disaster relief of any kind is still questionable. The understanding of how federal disaster, at least federal disaster, is administered in the states has always been a hard thing for a lot of people to grasp. The 75-25 split, who is entitled to it, how does a state become eligible for the grants? That's always been kind of a murky area, but what hasn't been is that if your house is underwater, if you had to be evacuated from your home, there are things that we can count on the federal government to do and be there, to be proactive, that the search and rescue teams are there before the storm hits. That, for example, I'll give you an example. The people that's called DSA, Disaster Survival Assistance, DSA. These are the people that go out and knock on doors after disaster. They are the most robust, eager, enthusiastic people to try to determine who is in need of help and who isn't getting it. They may be marginalized people. They may not have cable TV or internet. So they will walk in the wake of a disaster up these dirt roads and knock on the farm door. Hey, just to let you know, FEMA's here. Here's the things that we're doing for your community. That's gone. That's been erased. We're no longer going to be doing that.
I guess my real concern, or the thing I'm most baffled about, is that given the fact that it's only 0.87% of the budget, why did they choose this? Why did this become, such a burning need? I mean, I know we've got a lot of propaganda about the misuse of funds. Oh, they're, underwriting drag shows or, all that kind of garbage. But in the big picture, I mean, these people are just as intelligent as anyone else, I would assume, in terms of having capacity for critical thinking. So I just don't get, why did they pick this particular 0.87% of the budget to go after?
I think that was, I think the strategy was to start with a soft target. So the perception was that foreign assistance that goes to people who don't, outside the United States, they don't have a vote, they don't matter. They saw the same surveys we saw, which is that people thought that 25% of the federal budget was going to foreign assistance. So it was a soft target. When I've talked to people around the country, mostly virtually, right, because I'm in Situate, the same as Bill, and it's different groups, I would estimate that at least 50% of them had never heard of USAID before January. So the only thing they heard, the first thing they heard and the only thing they heard was that this is an evil and corrupt agency. And so there was no constituency for foreign assistance. And so it was a soft target. It was an easy place to start. Start somewhere small, start somewhere easy. If we can make that happen, let's move to the next target.
There also is another dimension to consider there, is that, and I can use SNAP benefits as an example. Where can you cause pain points? Where can you apply pressure points? Easy target, but apply something that it's painful to a significant portion of the human population and a significant portion of people in communities' care. So why would anybody vote against SNAP benefits? It's all related.
If the FEMA commission decides that states will be responsible, what do you see as how equipped, for instance, say a devastating hurricane hit Cape Cod, lots of destruction, and who do we look to in the state to knock on the doors?
Yep.
Or
Yep.
do all
That-
that?
A great question, very appropriate question, and that's all going to fall to MEMA, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Association. FEMA has had a great relationship with MEMA. We do a lot of training with all the states all through the year. It's not a question of if this responsibility will go to the states. It's a question of how much proportionately, and how are the states going to prepare for it? They're not, because nobody knows what it's going to look like. So to answer what your question is, my guess would be that FEMA will have to do some major response in some states just to give people the idea that this is the stuff that you're now going to be responsible for. My concern is that there's not going to be enough or any of that warm-up period, that people aren't going to, the emergency management people in our communities, your CERT team down in Barnstable, right? Barnstable, are not going to get the support that they normally get from Mass Task Force 1 up in Beverly. And how they're going to find out about it? Too little, too late.
Well, maybe I forget what the issue was that New England and then the California and Pacific Northwest were regionalizing. There was something that happened a few months ago that the government was pulling back, and so regionally, New England states were banding together. So maybe with
Oh, yeah, well, certainly the colleges are doing that. 7 states now are suing the current administration to release FEMA funds. Currently, today, they're doing that. So, there's power in numbers, yeah.
Those were excellent questions, and unfortunately, I seem to be the one that has to address the elephant in the room relative to the last question.
I'm losing weight. Oh, never mind.
The question about why USA was such an easy target might be corollary to the immigration issue. The fact that if you can afford a $500,000 gold visa, you have access to expedited processing through our immigration and naturalization service. And if you happen to be a white South African, similar special treatment is being afforded. Could it be that maybe that those brown people don't matter? And that's a hot one.
He's much more politically sensitive than I. I think it would be naive for anybody to say that money has not been a factor in some of our recent challenges. Hope that good.
I would just have to say it certainly appears that way. It certainly appears that that's the case.
I think it's a fair thing to say.
Yeah.
I got a FEMA-related question.
Yes, sir.
I guess historically, with the condition of FEMA, I mean, I'm old enough to remember FEMA really didn't exist. I mean, we relied back, historically, you read about the Dust Bowl. Everybody helped their neighbors out. FEMA, federal government wasn't there in full force. Now it's being cut back at the federal level. Historically, what states would really take it responsibly to really invest their time and energy? To your point about it not being an issue, obviously it was to some people in those states that really made a wholehearted investment, I'm trying to get, the question is, at the federal level, keeping it in front of our representatives is one thing. But now, if it is gonna fall back to the states, who at the state level, especially if it's a very responsive state, historically, it's been responsive to FEMA or MEMA, who do we talk to? Who's the ones we're gonna get? Is that the local legislators and even town level? I mean, local, you start out locally, you go regional. So it's everybody, it's not just the federal level we can look at. Is that correct?
It's exactly right. And I had used the SANS group as because I'm on their board, we have kind of a little bit better insight than most places. So we're actually forming neighborhood committees to say, okay, if you're along this seawall, these people will be your pivot point and they will help you. So when you think about disaster relief funding, what is it that triggers that as an importance? A disaster. We haven't had a disaster of major proportions in a long time. So that disaster preparedness money is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking because of two things. One, the imperative seems to, and Paul was saying this, if it's not front and center, it kind of goes away. But also, we've always got FEMA. We've always got those other people. Both those equations have changed. So now we have to do something about it. And we have to let our legislatures know that we're concerned about it. Tell me what it looks like. Tell me what it looks like from your perspective and what you guys are doing about it. From a local level, to a state level, to a national level, to an international level. We care, which means you have to care. What are you going to do about it? Ma'am. Oh, sorry.
When did all this change? When did it change?
The precipitous change in the language and direction concerning FEMA, one of the major tipping points I remember because I was in Connecticut dealing with their flooding, and we had people going door to door knocking on different areas, and one of the FEMA heads had said, no, you don't have to go down that street. And it was a street that was heavily laden with Trump signs. Now, let me give you some background on that. In Connecticut, our next door neighbor in Connecticut, I had people on the streets that were being physically and verbally accosted. So as a manager, what do I do for their safety? You pull them off the street. You don't want to get into a scenario that spins out of hand. You don't want the press there to say, what did FEMA do to precipitate this? You get them out of harm's way. What happened in Florida happens everywhere. If there's an alligator in the bloody sidewalk, we pull the people whose safety is paramount. In this case, there were people who did not appreciate the federal government being on their street. Get them out of it. So the sentiment that's being expressed for FEMA started to change at that moment. Certainly, the crisis that is now FEMA, and I think that, you can put your own perspective on this, has been exacerbated under the current administration. I don't think that that's being too risky. Yes, ma'am.
So, looking forward, it's tough to get the outrage and talking to their representatives only because they keep hitting us with so many things, and we're trying to do that on so many fronts. But you mentioned young people. Have you been able to get into colleges?
We've been working on the last thing we did down on the South Shore. We had 2 or 3 younger folk come up to us, and I said, help us, sit down with us, and we're making plans to do this. Tell us what direction to go in, beyond, posting it in Facebook or Instagram, what do I have to, and there are ways to make it pertinent to younger people. I mean, if we start talking about AI and the effects of AI on their lives, I can make it almost instantaneously, but I just got to get them to do that initial listening, like you guys are here. You're going to come, you're going to listen, at least with an open mind, and then make your own decisions. Paul has 2 younger daughters, and we were just talking about it, that communicating with this generation is an absolute necessity, but also a challenge. Any comments on that?
That's great.
Well, to Tracy's point, this is great that you're speaking to older citizens, older people.
Experienced, yeah.
Experienced, to Tracy's point, yeah, getting on college campuses, but even if it's humanitarian from the USA standpoint, and it's humanitarian from the local field, I even say churches, and, you know.
We've had some.
Go to churches and synagogues and mosques, and just say, this is all affects you guys.
Yep.
And solicit the clergy to help,
And some of those different houses of worship have been very active in the community. We've had great success with it. We had a meeting a couple weeks ago on a different topic, but one of the new clergy members was there, a young guy, ready to rock. You know, he's like, tell me what I could do. Yeah. That's a great point, a great entree point.
I have a question about what to do next, because we do live in Massachusetts, and it's certainly our expectation that our senators were not in support of cutting U.S. aid, and were not in support of cuts to FEMA. How can we in Massachusetts have an impact? I mean, should we be reaching out to senators in other states?
Absolutely.
What's the best approach, and who are those people who have, who may be a pain point for them if we make a stink?
There are a lot of, I've been monopolizing. Do you have suggestions in this regard?
Yeah, so I have reached out to churches in Situate, and there's a clergy association, so I've met with the clergy association. And talking with churches, synagogues, mosques, they're actually great to talk to for a couple of reasons. One is they have a mission of service to their fellow humans. The other is, I didn't realize this, but I've come to realize it. So many churches in the United States, whether big or small, have some kind of supportive programs overseas. Either they're big enough to support their own program, or they're paying into a collective program, right? And actually, in some cases, that makes the argument really easy, because they might say, oh, you USAID people, you're evil or corrupt. And I say, well, do you realize World Vision's budget was 40% USAID? And they respect World Vision, or they respect Christian Relief or Adventist Relief, right? So then it's like, oh, okay. So it's easy to get people to think differently. But to your point, and so I asked them, please write to your member of Congress, right? But the other thing I asked them is, well, you're the Episcopalians. Do you know Episcopalians in other states? Do you know, the ministers, the pastors, they get together. Do you know any in, I have to be upfront about this. Do you know any in red states, right? Like, who do you know in Georgia, in Alabama, right? Across the South. Would you be willing to have people come and talk to your congregations about these issues in those areas? And then trying to connect people like me with experience who live in those areas. Because one of the things that happened is that when the Trump administration sacked 10,000 federal workers related to foreign assistance, they seeded the country with all these people with experience who no longer were limited by their federal employment to speaking out. So now we're actually in a process of doing training for people in these other areas to say, here's how you go and talk to population groups, this is what you say. Getting to Bill's earlier point, the idea is not to be partisan. So don't go out and criticize anybody or any group. Just talk about all the fantastic things that we have done and could do in the future, should we choose to do that.
The things that have gone, and because it's out of sight, out of mind,
Mm-hmm.
you're
Yep.
not gonna miss it till it's gone.
Yep.
And until you need it. And you gotta keep it in the forefront of not just the legislature, but the people who
Especially.
are gonna go, I thought they were gonna here to help me, and there's nobody there to help me.
And there's common ground there. I mean, there's common ground that we can establish. Paul and I are meeting next week with a state senator in Massachusetts who is not exactly on the, at first glance, not exactly aligned with some of the things that we are talking about. But Paul's imperative is put that aside. Let's find some common things that we can talk about, agree on, and move forward on. Because there are those things that are important to us, like people dying, that we all care about and can agree on.
I don't believe that people's values have changed at all. But what's happened is that we all are operating under a different set of facts. And the media is really not very helpful. I see it on the left and on the right. I see a financial incentive to lock down your audience. So I do watch Fox and I do watch MSNBC, and there are some things they have in common. And one of the things they have in common is don't talk to the other side. Don't listen to the other side, right? So they have an interest in keeping us separated. And when you get an audience, particularly an audience that's purple, or even blue or even red, the commonest thing I hear from people is, I never heard that before. No matter what, no matter how basic the fact I say something, they say, I still get a lot of people like, I never heard that before, because of the type of media they consume. And so we've been separated. If you're looking for a villain, I think the villain is the media, right? They have an interest in separating us.
There's plenty of villains.
Right?
There's quite a few villains out there.
Well, I think that's where the core issue is, really. We're deviating to a different topic, yeah.
Come back to terms that
Yeah.
you're probably more familiar with. Disasters usually, floods would be included in that condition that would require a FEMA response.
Yes, sir.
But when flooding the zone with shit is the watchword of an entire political party, coming from the chief political strategist of that party throughout 3 election cycles, I'm saying that your comment about the media being the problem or the parties, encouraging each other not to talk to each other may not be the worst of the problems.
Certainly communication, the way that we choose to communicate. Yeah.
Well, I think that there's always been that message out there. For example, so you can hear, I'm an immigrant. I arrived in 1992. And I remember in my early days turning on the radio, and there was a guy saying, the job of the federal government is not to help people that need help. It's not to take my money and give it to someone who needs money. And I was coming from another country. I was like, well, yeah, that is the job of the federal government. But he was saying this, and he was saying that, but if you listen to the mainstream media, they're going to tell you that that's what the job of the government is. Don't listen to the mainstream media. And that was way back in 1992. I subsequently heard who this guy was. Any guesses? Anyone?
Rush Limbaugh.
Yes, exactly.
We all knew who it was, right?
It was Rush Limbaugh. And so when I've read up about it since, he is actually the person that people say he began this. Not just by saying, here's a message, but don't listen to them. Don't listen to them. And he was saying that kind of, I think, frankly, vile stuff. It sounds that way to me. But I'm just saying there's a long history of having that message. It's just that now we've shut ourselves off from alternative voices, and we all live in these like media bubbles where we only listen to, you know, what we like, what we agree with. And I wouldn't say the left is any less subject to this than the right. It's just that we think we're correct, and we think they're wrong, and they think they're correct. And we're
Because
not.
of the science and the facts and the history, you know, rational, critical thinking, mostly.
Yeah, no, well,
Yeah, well, yes. There's, when logic is entered into the debate, it's helpful.
yeah.
So, anyway, you want to wrap up. Where do I sign up to be your tour manager? It set up the tours going around because you guys are doing a great job.
Thank you
This
so
is-
much.
this is very
To
Very
imagine, we get the band on the road.
Take the message on the road.
That's really kind of you. Thank you. And thank you for coming out
Yeah,
and being
guys, in this
interested
weather.
and exercising your prerogative to at least try to enlighten yourselves and your neighbors. Thanks a lot. Oh, well, to you too.
So the bottom line here is you need to all go out and spread the word. 0.87, that's how much we spend.
And we need to get our representatives at forums like this.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. So
Yep.
we've got a little work ahead. So.
Yeah, thankfully, we have some people that are,
Thank you for being here. It was-
thank you very much for having us. What a
Yeah,
delight.
Thank you.